This is our fifth and last video on extinctions. So in this video, we're going to look at a tale of two salamanders and sort of some controversy with conservation and how we look at species and preservation of biodiversity. The California tiger salamander, which is shown in this picture, it's spotted and really adorable, is endangered in some areas and threatened in others. It's endemic to Central California. So that means that it would only be found in Central California. That's where it's native to, and it's restricted to that geographic area. Adults eat mostly insects. Larvae, so their larval stage, which would be aquatic, is going to eat algae, insects, tadpoles, and other small stuff that you might find in a small pond type environment. They live primarily underground in burrows that are made by other animals, and they breed primarily in vernal pools. So those are those pool wetlands that form in the kind of winter and springtime here on the West Coast. Their main threats are habitat fragmentation, so you can think about where vernal pools form. They form in these nice wetland areas with great soils for farming, so most of their habitat is probably converted into agricultural area. They have new predators in the form of bullfrogs and other things like cats, and they are vulnerable to pesticides because they have semi-permeable skin and they're on both the terrestrial and the aquatic surfaces, so they get exposed to all of the chemicals, and if their breeding grounds are in Central California, adjacent to or within agricultural areas, there's going to be a lot of pesticides present in those areas. They're also killed by on-road or off-road vehicles during their mating season when they're going to have to migrate between these vernal pools. So that part of the story is pretty familiar to us, our witnessing the decline of all of these species. But here comes a part that you might not expect. So the barred tiger salamander was intentionally introduced into this area where the California tiger salamander lives as fish bait, which is super sad and makes me frowny face. It has a much larger natural range, and you can tell it apart physically. It has a larger head and mouth, so it can eat a larger variety of food sources, so insects, but also slugs, worms, or other small amphibians, because it has that larger gape. So having a bigger mouth allows that particular salamander to eat a wider variety of food. So you can think about when we looked at spotted owls versus barred owls and specialists versus generalists, here the California salamander is a little bit more of a specialist and the barred tiger salamander is a little bit more of a generalist. However, much like or similar to our spotted owls, these two species can also have interspecies hybrids. Interestingly, they are pretty genetically different from each other, almost as different as humans are to chimpanzees, who cannot mate together and have a successful hybrid, as far as I know. But these two can. So down on the bottom there, you see the hybrid has slightly larger spots, not quite as long as the bars. But there's been 50 years of hybridization in Salinas area populations. The hybrid larvae are more likely to survive than either parent species larvae. So unlike most interspecies hybrids, this hybrid is not only as viable as parents, but more viable. It's more likely to survive. Genes from the barred salamander have migrated into the California tiger salamander populations. So that means that things that we would normally associate with being barred salamander genes, so we would look at their DNA and say, oh, that's a barred salamander. Those genes have gone into a hybrid by these two species hybridizing together, right? These two have this baby. Genes go from this one into it because it made that baby. Then maybe this one goes and mates back with some original California tiger salamander. Those genes make it back into that population. And the survival of those genes within the original California tiger salamander population kind of hints at that they are promoting better survival because those genes are becoming more prominent. So it is possible that the barred salamander genes will soon be present in all California tiger salamanders. So what does that say for our conservation and for thinking about biodiversity? Do we want these two species to, or is this the loss of the California tiger salamander if it's kind of slowly becoming the barred salamander? What does that mean for the conservation of our California tiger salamander? Are we going to target our conservation at all of these salamanders now? Can we distinguish between a California tiger salamander, a California tiger and barred tiger salamander hybrid, and the kind of gradient between those? Where do our protections sort of stop? How do we decide who we conserve, and how do we kind of address this now very mired question? And what does that mean for the food web? So if you had one species, much like the spotted owl, that has a more restrictive diet, just eating insects, and then you get a more dominant species or generalist species coming in that is more successful, that eats a larger section of the food chain or food web, how is that going to impact the rest of the food web? Because now we are going to have food sources that are disappearing that wouldn't normally be, right? They're not adapted to this particular predator. So maybe that's fine, but it might have impacts that we wouldn't expect. Okay, so trying to lighten up this intense and heavy lecture series on extinctions, what can we do to help preserve biodiversity? You can buy responsibly, but this is really hard. So you can look for sustainably harvested labels on, things like tuna fish or packaging that has, I'm going to show you some labels. These types of labels on it, so sustainable forestry, sustainable palm oil, all of these are going to hopefully indicate that there are better practices happening. But this is part of a problem called greenwashing, where we just find like a label that says organic or something that we want, and then we think that's okay to buy, but we don't really understand anything about that labeling process. Or maybe we don't buy something that was part of more responsible farming practices, but didn't have the money to apply to become labeled officially as an organic farm. So there's a lot of problems with this labeling process. You can look for those labels, it's a good start, but often it's not enough, and there isn't enough education about how we can suss that stuff out. I don't even know how we can suss that stuff out. One thing I do know a little bit more about is creating habitat, and this is tough. Many of you might not have your own place. You might not have a yard. So even if you're renting, often landlords will be kind of specific on what you're allowed to do to that yard space, right? So I am fortunate enough now to have my own yard, so I can plant California native plants, and that provides native habitat. I could plant any plants, but if I plant California native plants, those are going to be plants that produce flowers and fruits that organisms from this area will know how to use, or organisms that travel through this area will be used to finding. So planting native plants can help our native pollinator species or native insect species that might be on their way to extinction that we don't even know because they haven't been assessed yet. We can help preserve those species by providing them these little islands of habitat, because any island of habitat that you create means that the fragmentation between habitats will be slightly lessened, and that could make all of the difference. If you want to find out what plants are native to this area or what might grow well in your particular yard, I'd highly encourage you to contact the Native Plant Society. We have a North Coast chapter, and they sell plants. Even right now in quarantine, they're selling plants at the Neeland Glen farm stand because they're seen as an essential business. So I highly recommend, if you have the time and space, to carve that out for some native plants. The last one, remember how there were 2 million documented species or described species, and we vastly have underestimated that number, right? We don't even know what's out there to say whether it's going extinct or not, or how to protect it. We also don't know distributions of organisms. We don't know phenology of organisms. And all of that is information you can contribute to on any given day, as much or as little as you want, with as much or as little pre-information, knowledge on the topic as you have, right? So iNaturalist is an app. It's also a website, and anybody can use it, and it's amazing. And I'm going to show you my house. So this is my map of observations from just my house area. I'm trying to document the biodiversity around my house. Obviously, I have some biases here on the things that I know and understand. So all of those pink dots are different fungal observations. The green ones are plants. I think the orange ones might be insects. And blue, gosh, I don't know what blue is. Birds. I think blue is birds, because that's where the power lines are. So just looking around my house and my yard, I found 116 different species. And like with birds and insects, I often don't know even the first thing about getting them to a group. So I will just use the AI suggestion for what it is, and then other people can come in and identify that for me. So getting that information out there, even if you don't know what it is, if you put the picture and as much information as you can about how you found it and where you found it and when you found it, about its conditions and environment that it's in, all of that information can be used by scientists or just regular people to help us understand our global biodiversity and our local biodiversity. So I highly encourage that you at least check out iNaturalist. It's super approachable, and you don't need to know anything about anything to use it. All you need to do is have a camera. And I know that that is a bar for a lot of people, but hopefully fewer people now that smartphones tend to always have them. So check it out. It's an amazing tool. It has certainly changed my life.